From South Sudan to North Korea, just some of the foreign hotspots CBC News has taken you over the past year. It continues a tradition and a commitment that reaches back to the Second World War. Covering the world is expensive and often dangerous. So, why do it? Last night, a number of our foreign correspondents gathered here in Toronto for the National in Conversation to ponder that and to take questions. Please have a look.
Everyone here presumably are news junkies, everyone watching, but I actually have friends who refuse to watch the news. They don't want to know about bad news, they don't want to see it, and unfortunately, that's not unusual. There are a lot of people like that. What would you say to people like that?
All right, give us one line on why it's important to understand what's happening on the other side of the world. You know?
One line. That's
Yeah.
so mean, Peter.
I'm trying.
I've already used up my line.
That's your line next.
It's important to be informed, but I would say because we're inundated from so many sources, and you choose your sources carefully. You don't need to be watching 24 hours a day, but if you choose your sources carefully, because we feel the same way in this current environment too, I think, with Trump, in Turkey as well. Sometimes I don't turn on the TV, but I'm still consuming information from reliable sources. So sticking your head in the sand doesn't solve the problem.
Ma'am?
Here's my line. I was talking to a evangelical pastor in Alabama about why Canadians would care about what happens in the United States. And the line we eventually settled on, which he said to me was, well, I suppose you would want to know if your neighbor's house was on fire.
Keith?
Trying to punctuate my sentence so that just sing one.
So it's all one.
Yeah. So I think the Trump election taught us two things, colon. One, I think, is the familiar lesson that a lot of people learned, that if they weren't paying attention to what was going on and they didn't get involved, that elections have consequences and the result may not have been what they wanted. But there was a lesson, and I think we should not be self-righteous about this. There was a lesson for us, too, in not following everything that was going on in the country. We missed a big part of the Trump story because we thought we were well enough informed about what was happening in America, and we just weren't.
All right, question here in the audience, right over here, sir.
Can you give examples of the challenges you face separating the emotional attachment or how situations tear at your heartstrings or incense you while maintaining your professionalism and objectivity?
All right, great question. I'm going to ask Margaret to handle it because I want you to watch something that Margaret did just a couple of weeks ago in South Sudan that had a huge impact on anyone who saw it, and we want to know the impact it had on her doing it. Watch this.
Each time a flight passes, they're dropping enough food to feed 1,500 people for 1 month. 7 passes today. But the conflict shifts from place to place like a disaffected suitor. The whole country is hurting. This is what starvation looks like in the capital, Juba. Teresa is so critical, she needs a feeding tube, still dressed in her best for her trip to the hospital. 4-year-old Bak also has acute malnutrition and tuberculosis on top of that. There is no money for his treatment. Shriven bodies with old souls are everywhere you look, the ward overflowing. Some children on the ground outside, hovering between a beginning or an end.
So how do you deal with that?
Well, not well, apparently, because you look at the images and it comes back to you. But that, it's something that I kind of grappled with early on in my career. And I've actually had to remind myself a little bit in the wake of South Sudan, because those kids, you look them in the eye, you lock eyes, with these little boys who were dead a few days later. You lock eyes with their mothers who are stricken and sometimes look ashamed because their kids are perishing in front of them. And it's difficult to, they dance in my head. But that's what they're supposed to do on a certain level. And this is sort of how I deal with it anyway. I think everybody has their own ways. But that's what we're here to do. We're here to bear witness. We're there to go and see. We're there to remember them. I worry about having caused, Bach in particular, the little 4-year-old boy, distress because we were big and they don't see that many white people, these kids. And I felt like we were frightening him. And that really haunts me too. But if you don't show those kids, you don't know what's happening and you can't save the next kid. And all of that helps when you're trying to deal with, some of the stuff that you see.
Nala?
No, Margaret's exactly right. I think the only thing that helps balance what are obviously very human reactions that we have in the field to certain situations is the fact that we do get to tell the story. In a way, it's an action. When you see someone who's lying there, and you see someone who's in the most intimate moment of their life, in a sea, for example, where I saw them trying to be saved and getting onto a ship or walking across Europe. I mean, it's a very intrusive process that we're involved in. We're barging into these people's lives. And I do feel like I owe something. I owe telling a story to someone else. And so that helps me balance my own feelings about what I see on the ground.
I remember one situation years ago when I was covering the tsunami in Thailand after the earthquake there, and there was a Canadian team that was actually doing an autopsy on one of the bodies. And it's not like Canada. Basically, they were pulling out the bodies, and they were right there, and I was right there with my camera. And you smell it, you feel it, you see what's there in front of you. You have to capture it because that's the only way to get some of this across. You have to capture it, of course, in a certain way that tells the story without being unnecessarily gruesome. But from my perspective, when things were sort of the toughest, the fact that I was looking through the camera, it allowed me to get just enough distance to be able to continue doing that job and telling the story when, in fact, as I say, you're watching somebody's actually being cut open in order to find out what happened.
I also remember specifically when I was covering the shooting in San Bernardino, emotions being very raw there, and I happened to be invited to the home of the family of one of the 14 victims, Tin Nguyen. She was a 31-year-old public health inspector at San Bernardino. And this is hours after the family themselves had learned that that their cousin, their sister, their daughter was among one of the victims. And these things, I find sometimes they don't hit you until after. I sort of almost feel like I had kind of like almost tunnel vision just to do the job and to sort of honor this person by telling her story. But I remember it wasn't until I got back to the hotel and sort of just had time to decompress. And that's when you start to get emotional, when you have time to yourself. And in those types of moments, I call someone I love, which is what I'm sure many of you do as well.
I remember 9/11. All of us do, obviously. I'd been on the air for many hours, and finally got a break around 4 o'clock the morning after. And the little message light was blinking on my phone. And, I checked, it was my daughter. It was one of my daughters in Winnipeg. And so I called her and I said, "Hi, what's up?" And she said, "Just want to know I love you." So it's kind of the same thing. And for me that night, it made me connect that whole story in a way I hadn't thought of. I'd been so busy on the air. I knew, obviously, I knew the scope of things and how, what a disaster it was and what it could possibly lead to. But I hadn't sensed the impact it was having on people everywhere, that they wanted to connect with family, wherever that family was, that it was important for them to touch base.